Welcome, crypto enthusiasts, to the Independent Reserve Podcast.
All right. Episode 14 of the Independent Reserve Podcast. Jake Denny, this has been a long time coming.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Most importantly, you brought one of your Epic jackets.
I felt like I needed to.
I went through and trawled some of your background, but the thing that everybody, and I definitely want to know, is how many jackets do you own?
I have a decent collection of jackets, and similar to Elton John, I may go broke based on my my addiction to fashion.
Have you got what's the rough number?
It's a good question. I would estimate it would have to be 30 to 40.
30 to 40.
Yeah, somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
I try to not overcompensate, but you always need a good range. You need to be able to look in there in the mornings and decide what mood you're in.
Decide what mood you're in.
That's right.
When did you start collecting the jackets?
Good question. I think it was probably year 12 formal. I took a sheet into a designer, a friend of mine. She was getting a ball gown made, and I went in with her, and I asked to get the suit from Will Smith's Get Jiggy With It made. He told me to get out of his shop, and I had to sit outside and wait for her to get fully sized. And from that moment when I was told I wasn't allowed to have the jacket or the suit made, I decided that I was going to go and collect as many ridiculous jackets as I could. And
but they're not ridiculous. They're phenomenal, and they're always great. And everyone always comments about Jake. As soon as you met Jake, I love his jackets.
It's it's definitely an acquired taste.
Not at all. I've done some actually. I know you're a sales guy and you've done a bunch of consulting stuff, lots of stuff in the US. But the one thing I found that I don't think anyone would know, and I can't believe you've never told me this. You were the tour manager for Silverchair.
Yeah. A small known fact.
Small known fact. We've got to make that public. Tell us about it. Let's start there.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a long way around, but I did go to high school with the band.
Oh, you're a
Silverchair.
New boy, of course.
I'm a Newcastle boy, so Newcastle High. And so I guess that's where I met them and became friends with the guys. And just a sort of long way around as a young guy, I was deciding my career was going to be in music. And I organised a couple of tours for Silverchair and worked at the record label.
EMI?
EMI Music. And we were distributing 11 Music, which was distributed through Virgin, and got to work on the Young Modern record for Silverchair there. And their tour manager could no longer do it. And so they said, do you want to be a tour manager? And you don't often get the call up to travel the world with a rock band. And so you have to say yes to that question. So I left the label, which is where I thought I was going to end my career, and travel the world with a band. And it was a great experience.
Nice, because obviously they were a big act. It was definitely one of Australia's biggest exports back in the late 90s, I guess.
Yeah, I guess they came to prominence in the mid 90s for sure, on the back of the grunge era. And I guess what sort of defined Silverchair was their willingness to challenge what people expected of them and go away for long periods of time and think about where they wanted to take their music and their identity. And I was proud to be part of that and be a humble part of the touring party of that. But it was a great experience, and I think you learn a lot. You sort of learn in that world. Thinking on your feet really counts. You're sort of doing everything from security plans and controls to settling tabs with Live Nation at some of the big music festivals and venues they do. And and we did some pretty great things. So it was an exciting period.
How good. So I know you're now, I guess everyone knows you, not just for the jackets, but you're a COO at Pier Two, which you do a lot of ETH staking infrastructure work. But you also did a lot of consulting work, particularly in the US. So you were in LA for a long time, weren't you? Doing a bunch of stuff over there?
Yeah, I was. I think, what ultimately took me to the US initially was Silverchair. So over there, doing the entertainment thing and traveling and living in rock hotels as you do in that world. And I got to see a lot of the US, probably more than just the coast that most people get to experience on trips there or even just working. And so that really opened my eyes to what the US sort of held in terms of it being much more diverse than just the coast that people are normally used to. And so I fell in love with the US and decided I needed to go there. I bought a ticket in the green card lottery and I won.
Did you?
Yeah, that's ultimately how I ended up there. So I had jumped into the early stages of mobile tech
Yep.
And I knew that was a bit of an edge. The US was sort of trending behind. It was probably one of the areas that Australia had a certain edge on in a technology adoption was mobile tech. And so I knew that having the experience that I did in Australia would certainly come in demand in the US at some point. And so sort of followed that journey there and helped grow startups, lived in New York for a couple of years, lived in LA for about 7 years and traveled the US, opened offices there, built businesses there. And it was an exciting period for sure.
Yeah.
And really cut my teeth on how to do scrappy startups. Some were fantastic, some blew up, and some of them are still sort of growing and doing, hundreds of millions a year in revenue. So it's definitely a learning experience of understanding the speed and the aggression of trying to build businesses in the US and abroad.
So yeah, I know when I was looking through your resume, you've always been an entrepreneur. Really, you've everything from, I guess, tour management to where you work with Juice Mobile, doing that mobile stuff that you just talked about. You were Channel 9 for a while, doing all the sales and marketing stuff there as well.
Yeah, I was the mobile guy that would get rolled out to explain why mobile's the future and you need to think about that screen. And it was a hard sell back in the day.
Really, back in the day. So
yeah,
I guess you probably a lot of parallels now with crypto, explaining why that is.
There really is, and I think we can get into some of that from community to early tech to dealing with some regulatory hurdles around what that looked like. But we within that group, it was a joint venture between Microsoft and PBL Media at the time, which is Nine Entertainment today. And it was an exciting period for sure, advocating what people could do, how they could interact with their TVs via mobile devices, from SMS to things on phones to when the iPhone first launched, trying to bring all of our new magazines online into a mobile format. It was a big format shift for sure from traditional news media, even though it was digital. We certainly had some uphill battles to try and educate the market, advertisers, brands on why they needed to be there, and then that was ultimately funding the content shift. And it was definitely a great period of time.
So back then, like everyone obviously has a smartphone now. Everyone has smart TVs now and streaming and all this kind of stuff. You couldn't really. It's going to be very difficult for people to imagine what it was like before all this stuff, right? But back then, what were some of the real challenges and what were some of the real objections, excuse me, that you were dealing with at the time?
Well, I remember at one point we had Steve Ballmer come out to Australia to have sort of a meeting with all the Microsoft entities, and when he was attending, a lot of people were holding up their phones when he gave a speech to all the team, and everyone was holding up the iPhone. It was a fairly new device at the time. It had only just come out in Australia. It's about 2008, and he really did not like that. He did not like the idea that Microsoft employees were effectively jumping over to Apple devices, where Microsoft had a decent market share in mobile phones at that point. Nokia and Motorola were sort of the main ones.
Big, didn't they?
Yeah. And so there was this idea that we were not allowed to use iPhones, despite the fact that all of our audience was going to an iPhone format. So there were challenges all the way up to the very top, and he's a very smart
even within the tech,
even within that world.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think where we were sort of shifting was people who are using Twitter or now X would know it's like, why is it 160 characters? Or 140 characters initially, and it was because a SMS would be 160 characters, and the last 20 was the unsubscribe function that you had to include at the end of any sort of message. And so, even things as basic as tweets were really sort of governed by the limitations of SMS format, which was 160 characters. And so people don't understand why we have those sort of legacy parts, and obviously we've gotten rid of a lot of that today in the long formats. But there were a lot of challenges. How people access content. Apps when they first came out. Kleiner Perkins, when they initially put out that fund to incentivize people to build apps for the App Store, that was what really drove that proliferation of mobile adoption. And Australia was, I think we were number 2 in the world, behind only Korea at that point in terms of mobile adoption. So, it was probably one of the first examples where you could point to Australia and say Australia was really ahead of the curve in terms of tech adoption, because we definitely lagged in internet adoption. That came here sort of much later than it did initially in the US, and that was mostly because of service providers, dial-up, if you remember that sound, trying to someone
old
making a
modem,
phone, someone making a phone call and cutting you off the internet, all the good times. Whereas, this was, the initial era of like 3G, the idea that you could watch the cricket live, or you could video call someone, which no one really wanted to do at that time.
Yeah.
But it was breaking formats and breaking adoption. I mean, with all that tech, it's really sort of the backbone of why we even have things like TikTok today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating, actually. And there's so many parallels now with, I guess, the work you're doing. So, you're probably going through, it feels a bit like Groundhog's Day, where you're dealing with a lot of those same challenges in terms of the adoption, but also maybe the mindset of why do we need this new tech kind of stuff?
It is. It honestly is. The sell-in is probably more around the regulatory moat today. Perhaps before that, it was perhaps around financial institutions, around why does this matter? And I think people get fixated on prices, which makes a lot of sense, because what is fundamentally different around crypto or blockchain or DLT, whatever flavor you want to call it, but ultimately crypto, is this idea that information can also be money, which is a fundamental shift from where the internet sort of set off, was it wasn't allowed to be money. And just think about how clunky the idea or the experience is today. You put in your credit card details, absolutely, the date and the year, the month and the year, and then your 3-digit CCV, and then that's that's that clunkiness, and then it gets stolen and shared, and you have to get a new card. I literally just happened to me last week, and that just doesn't make a lot of sense when you've got this technology that exists. And I think we've been advocating for that technology shift, and what it ultimately means to people who use the internet. And I think that's the separation of that, or at least the education that goes behind. Yes, you can follow it, and yes, they have tokens associated, and they have value associated with people who are investing in that. And I think that's a really important part of why the adoption has gotten to this point. But now, at least, we're getting to a conversation of what does this technology mean, and particularly in an era of AI, it's even more important.
Yeah. So maybe, because I imagine the doors now are starting to open a lot more. Certainly we see it at the exchange a lot more. Just the amount of the cross-section of people in society going, okay, cool. 4 or 5 years ago, I could ignore this. Now I've got to learn something. I've got to work about it. And the types of people who before it was said it was a scam were kind of going, oh, okay, I've missed something here. Now I've got to come back. I've got to learn. So I imagine you're sort of seeing the same thing, where more people are opening the door and going, look, I've got to get, engage people like Pier Two to actually start seeing what can they potentially do for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's a part of that, which is the idea that, the financial returns from an investment perspective obviously got people to pay attention. When you've got Bitcoin outperforming, so many other categories, years, in the history, and, things like ETH as well, and Solana now. It's hard for people to ignore that, particularly from a funds perspective. And so whether it's a diversification strategy so that they're offering that as well, or people who have come from traditional finance have identified this opportunity where, they have the alpha because they're an early mover, and they can bring, the pedigree that they have from traditional finance into this space. I think that's exciting. That's who we typically interface with at Pier Two. So we work with a lot of those, financial institutions. We also work with a lot of protocols, so people who are actually building that technology, and that is a pretty electric environment to be in, to be honest.
Yeah, I bet. For everyone knows you in crypto. For those who for some reason haven't come across you or haven't come across Pier Two, did you want to give a quick sort of rundown of what you guys do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the company was founded in 2018. We really got our start, apart from, speculating on some of the areas and making some soft investments into particular protocols, was around Chainlink. So we began our journey there in the testnet with Chainlink, joined the mainnet in 19, and have been part of that journey ever since. So we're very proud to be part of Chainlink and everything that represents. And I think if you pay attention to what Chainlink's doing, even particularly in the back end of this year, it's pretty exciting. People are saying, tokenization of assets is a good thing. Real world assets, if that's even a thing that people actually use as vernacular in the real world, I'm not sure. But what it does sort of signal is there is a shift, and we've got traditional industries, even the Swift network, adopting that. And I think, it's exciting to see Chainlink at that forefront, and we're really excited to support them there. So that's always been a core element of what we've done. And based on that experience, that is ultimately operating what we call decentralized infrastructure. And that was a gap we identified in the market. We'd tried our hands at a number of different things, contributing to DAOs and working with a number of protocols, which is probably why we have that network, in that space, of such a period of time. Where we identified the opportunity, though, in the sort of new era is around staking. We knew when Ethereum sort of signaled that they were moving from proof of work to proof of stake, that was going to be a pretty big deal. So we began our sort of staking mission with Ethereum when they launched the Beacon chain. So that was in 2020, late 2020. So that was, and I had joined the company, during that period of, just on the other side of that first lockdown in 2020. It was difficult, it was remote, couldn't get up there to actually visit the team based in Queensland. So everything was sort of handled remotely, but it was pretty exciting what the vision was that the company had sort of outlined in terms of what that future could mean and how that was going to shift. And, I think it was pretty important for Ethereum as well to identify that the dependency on energy and compute power was going to sort of lead the chain into, a territory where it was going to be very difficult for it to maintain and grow adoption. A home staker of Ethereum today uses the equivalent energy of operating their fridge. That's a much more appealing prospect than what it was as a proof of work chain. So with proof of stake, the requirements there was, of course, this idea of the merge. So where they would ultimately merge the consensus layer and the execution layer of the chain, where you could be staking your assets and earning a yield on that. There is work that needs to be done. It's not this passive, yield that you just get from putting coins in. Work needs to be done to, attest to the chain, its accuracy and proposed blocks. And so typically where most people want to access that is through a service provider. And so that's where we come in, institutional service provider for staking. The opportunity for our entry into the market to deal with that customer set we saw was the ability to withdraw your ETH from the Beacon chain. Because without the ability to withdraw, we just couldn't see a major adoption there where funds could allocate, knowing that they could also, unallocate or shift to different chains and seize opportunities there. So, that was really enabled in April of 2023. We came out of the gates as Pier Two then, announced a few different things around that. And it's been a really steep growth trajectory for the company ever since. And we're excited. A lot of hard work.
Yeah, I bet.
Over many years.
Yeah, I mean, when you went through there, it's for a non-crypto native person, it's probably like double Dutch. But like, how do you sort of break that down for people who potentially sort of aren't sort of deep into the weeds in terms of how crypto works? So when you're dealing with like funds or whoever, people who are new to the space, how do you sort of break that down?
Yeah, the idea of staking, it really comes down to the security. So, where does this yield come from, I guess, is probably the first question. And so that comes from fees. So anytime people are transacting, and so this is just using the example of Ethereum, and it applies to a lot of other proof of stake chains as well. But this idea that every time you're sending a transaction or engaging with DeFi or doing anything on chain, you're paying ETH, these fees, or what we call gas, but it's effectively denominated in ETH. And that
transaction fee.
It's a transaction fee, exactly, and some of that gets burnt, and so that is to reduce the issuance of ETH, as now we're sort of getting into deflationary territory for ETH in its issuance, where the opportunity comes. You'll see liquidations on loans, activity in DeFi, just the demand on block space, as that increases, you'll see more transactions. And so the ability to attest to, each of these blocks that are happening every 12 seconds on Ethereum, those blocks are going into the chain. A single validator is selected at random to propose that block, and a set of validators are also attesting to the accuracy of that block. And then you've got this other component, which is like the sync committee, which is signing a signature hash of the security of the chain. And so, all these components roll up and generate a ETH yield, and that varies based on how many validators are part of the network. At this point, it's nearing about 1.1 million individual validators. That's not to say that's 1.1 million individuals. That's a number of validators. Each validator in Ethereum today is defined as a maximum and a minimum of 32 ETH.
Yep.
And so that has a decent price associated to it as well. So you can see why this sort of trends more towards institutions trying to allocate and participate. Effectively the introduction of EIP 4844, you had what effectively is a shift to blobs and moving that away to the layer twos. And so there is a narrative at the moment that the L2s are getting a bit of a free ride. This is a net good in terms of the costs for using and engaging with L2s. So I think, Ethereum is really meant to be the settlement layer. I think if you look at the plan of what Ethereum was intended to be and how it saw its sort of growth trajectory, it definitely relied on this proliferation of L2s. And where that gets a bit clunky today from a UX perspective is you can't easily move between, say, Polygon and Arbitrum and Base back to the mainnet. That is improving. It's improving quite dramatically. And I think some element of the fees get sort of stuck at that layer 2 level, which is revenue for those L2s. And so that is of some concern, at least on X. But I think if you look at what Ethereum was intending to do and how it was intending to grow and where that growth will come in terms of block space and demand, it's probably all expected, I would say, at this point. In 12 months' time, you'll probably see a lift in fees being generated back at the L1.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, just in really, really, really simple terms, I guess you could probably sort of categorize as going, hey, if you've got ETH and you want to get a yield on it, you contribute sort of security to the network. You deposit. It's like a term deposit in some ways. You kind of deposit your ETH and you park it aside. Yeah, that parking aside has the effect of securing the network a bit, and you get rewarded for that.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That's the intention. Difference is, the terms aren't sort of locked up, so you can pretty much get out on demand. And I think there's an appeal to that for sure. And then it gets a bit more complicated. I think, how does retail participate in this, for example, is one of the questions. And that's where, things like Lido come in. And so this concept of liquid staking tokens. And so where that operation sort of kicks in is the retail consumer says, I want to participate in this. In Australia today, it's very difficult for them to do that. In the United States, for example, if you're a retail customer on Kraken or Coinbase and exchanges as such, you can basically just put in whatever ETH you've got. A button will come up saying, do you want to stake it? Yes. And you'll get, the prorated part of the reward minus the fees. And most people are happy to participate in that if they're happy to hold on to that asset for a period of time. When it comes to liquid staking, that opens it up to a much larger base. And how that effectively works is you go to the interface, and Lido is an example. There are a few others, and the consumer can go put their ETH in there, get what is a representative token of that, which is liquid staking token, and that is a yield bearing token. Yeah. And so then they can go and use that token in DeFi, hold onto it, and it's yield bearing. And so I think there is a particular growth in what that means. And then you have a more complicated layer on top of that, which is restaking, which is, we can get into that if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is your bread and butter, I guess. This is this is really the infrastructure discussion about Ethereum and how the ecosystem or what infrastructure, however you want to call it, works. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes to adoption, I guess, some people, the retail crew or whatever you want to call them, or people who, for whatever reason, they want to participate, but they don't want to know the background. They just want to, they want the iPhone, they want the button mash, they want the big green button that says stake and I get a yield and I'm happy with that, and what happens behind the scenes happens. Right? That's kind of what we're getting to. We're probably not at the big green button where you just, but that's where it's heading, right? Yeah,
and look, and that's where it really should end up. No question about it. I think the idea that holding this asset, believing that this chain will be a global settlement layer, whether it's the world computer or the infinite garden, whatever you want to call it, this idea that Ethereum will sort of empower, a bunch of block space and the L2s will participate and help that along. There really should be an opportunity for retail to be able to participate in that if they are, holding that asset and they want to participate, and there are a bunch of different services they can do that. Today, I think where we need, clarity is, how do Australian retail participants engage with that? And I think that's certainly where we're heading. We need to make sure that it's done in sort of the right way with the right sort of guardrails in place. And then when that happens, I think you'll probably see, a different sort of shift in the mindset too, where there's been sort of negative connotations in crypto. It's like, it's a casino, there are thousands of tokens, people are just gambling. I think that shifts dramatically when people are, happy to hold Bitcoin for long periods of time, if they're happy to hold ETH for long periods of time, and they're earning a yield on that, it sort of adds to the incentive. And, for many people, that might be where they decide to, invest, and it is a generational thing too. I think it's probably unwise to think that this is something where everyone of every age needs to jump in and get on board. But if you think about, the average, young working person, young working professional in Sydney, Melbourne or any sort of capital city in the country, they want to, maybe buy a property. That's a really, really hard hill to climb at this point. Yeah, you've got the interest rates to consider, you've got the deposit to consider. There is a lot of burden around that. And, with inflation being where it is, you're getting eroded to some degree. And so that's where the appetite is picking up in these new asset classes. They, being younger, naturally understand this. They're digitally native. They've grown up with all these devices. They're a bit more familiar. It's not as steep a learning curve for them to understand what is Bitcoin or what is Ethereum or what is Solana. And so on that journey, you would expect to see a bigger adoption there. And so we just see staking as a natural part of that evolution.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and it starts getting a really big picture about the whole idea of how does crypto fit into into society, even into generation. We've got this emerging asset class, and Bitcoin and Ethereum, which has the potential to, we're still really early. I think everyone, even people who've been around for a number of years in crypto, still feel like it's very early in terms of adoption. And you've got this huge adoption curve and great potential returns. Not that you can give financial advice, but obviously being in the industry, we're bullish on it. And if you're a young person, particularly in Sydney, you can have a great job, you can have everything going for you, and still not be able to afford a decent place in your area.
Scary.
Because it's scary.
It is, yeah.
And you say, well, I can't just sit by the sideline and chase I could save for the next 15 years and I still won't have a deposit. You go, well, I need to do something. And so you of course, you're going to probably be pushed a little bit out that risk curve, and things like crypto and staking or yielding crypto products that yield better than traditional financial assets, I guess, or financial investments, and Bitcoin, which go, well, maybe I could 10x my money over here over the next generation, or 100x my money. And maybe now I'm a chance to play the game of, the game of homes. Yeah.
And I think, it's a really good point. And I think, as a parent, like I do think about this as well, like how would my kids get on the property ladder? Do they need to? Is Australia going to end up like Europe, where the idea of ownership is not something that's, achievable by many? I mean, this is a pretty contentious issue in Australia, and not just here, in many countries. But I think this idea that, young people can get a part-time job, work on an hourly rate, put away some of that money after they paid their tax, and then they could invest it into something. I would like to see that being an option that a younger generation could participate in. And I think it is important that they're doing it in a way that is safe and through trusted environments and the right exchanges. And it is likely that people will on board with exchanges today. We're seeing some great activity around ETFs. That there's exciting news happening in Australia with Ethereum as well. And Monochrome have been certainly one of the pioneers in this space. With Bitcoin already and ETH coming next. The way that people will access that will vary quite significantly. And so, it could be the parents putting away some, it's a long time horizon with all the volatility. It can get pretty scary if you're watching it, but kids aren't really watching that stuff, but they're also probably not paying attention to inflation relative to their hourly wage, net of tax. And so I think, there are a lot of considerations to be put into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so conference season is still going on. I know we were just in Singapore. I saw you there. In fact, we had a few side events, but you also you were in Bali, so you've been hitting, and you seem to be at everything these days. So how's the conference season been for you, and what did you get out of it?
Yeah, look, I think the conferences are really important. I think we made a couple of shifts within the way that we sort of operate our business as well. Is largely we deal with everything remotely. We've got a globally distributed team. We have to, because we've got this 24/7 sort of infrastructure we've got to maintain. So we've got a distributed team. We are an Australian founded company though, so we do have a concentration here. We, in this time zone within Australia, do focus sort of on the APAC region with a lot of APAC-based clients. We feel like the presence being there is really important. It's where a lot of energy is. I think if we were sort of relying just on the energy out of Australia, it would be a little disappointing. There is energy, there is money, there's insane amount of builders in this space that have come out of Australia. They just don't all remain here for a whole host of reasons. But where we've found that to be a really sort of energizing experiences, we're getting in front of them. They're coming in from all over the world. I think Singapore was a great example. 20,000 tickets sold, which was almost double last year. About an expected extra 10,000 that came on their back of that just for the side events you mentioned, and that was followed by Solana's Breakpoint, which was held in Singapore immediately after. And if you're part of that or around that, the buzz, the energy from all these people from all over the world descending on Singapore was electric. It was great for us. It was great to spend time with a lot of our partners, a lot of the protocols from around the world. And so, the conference season is important for us. Most of the events that we've been attending have been sort of in this region. So, like you said, CoinFest in Bali, Token 2049 in Singapore and Dubai. We'll be at DevCon in November, of course. We've got a SmartCon event for Chainlink happening in Hong Kong. And the shift there is actually telling in and of itself. I mean, even with Bullish acquiring CoinDesk and therefore Consensus, the conference that has historically, initially was happening in New York and then in Austin, even that's shifting. So, next year that moves to Toronto, and they're also adding another sort of Asian version of that too in Hong Kong. And I think that's pretty telling, as where there is uncertainty in certain jurisdictions around, is crypto welcome? Are the people who are building in that space welcome? Are the investors welcome? Asia is giving really clear guidelines on what that looks like to operate. And so people are wanting to go there and have those conversations in those markets. Yeah, absolutely. You have to be there.
Yeah, you have to be there. And one of the things I think that people tend to forget outside of the crypto space is just how global and interconnected crypto is. It's a native currency of the internet, right? And you you can just be anywhere in the world and you can work with anyone. We have we had the IMF guys on recently, and when they raise money, they just knew people from all around the world, and everyone just contributes USDC or ETH or whatever it is they want to contribute, and they can raise money from anywhere around the world at any point in time. It's not like when you work for a bank or whatever, and you're dealing just with Australian clients and you're dealing just with Australian developers because you're ring fenced here. You're not ring fenced. You're ring fenced by the internet, which is not much of a fence at all. So, sorry, I had that coughing right in the middle of it. Perfect. So you do have a truly global sort of like network of business that all interacts. So for you, you're not limited by any sort of, currently not really limited by any sort of jurisdiction, limited by whoever you can access the internet, and and then when you're traveling overseas, then you actually get to catch up with them, and it feels just like a borderless sort of community in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, for me, I started my crypto journey when I was living in Los Angeles. Definitely was hearing about Bitcoin as early as 2011. I'll be honest, I don't really understand what that was. I'm not a gold bug. But it made a lot of sense. The guy who sort of was telling me about it was a guy called William Quigley, who started Wax Token, and it was certainly one of the early contributors to Tether. And what he was saying when he was at Idea Lab was he was going into China, and they were investing in gaming startups, him and Brock Pierce, and they were coming back. It was very difficult to get money out of the US into China, and they sort of shared this one example in about 2013, and it became extremely apparent where this native internet money could really play a part. Was they couldn't get the money wire from the United States into China quickly enough to participate in a round for a very prominent known gaming company. They would accept Bitcoin.
Yep.
And so, that was fascinating because they were able to get money transferred from one jurisdiction to another to make that investment. But in discovering what the power of Bitcoin was, became a really sort of fascinating idea. Now, did that have the applications that we see today in, the broader space? No, we didn't. but it was pretty clear by the time Ethereum came around what that might look like. And so, a really great example of this now, it definitely came with a lot of negatives, but the ICO era. I mean, just the idea of capital formation around an ICO is a fascinating concept. It's such a powerful tool, being completely underutilized at this point because, in a lot of markets, including Australia, there are a lot of people who participated in that probably shouldn't have, or misled people in a variety of things. But there were also things that were quite legitimate that came from that era as well. And so I think, if we were to see a more structured version of ICOs come back to the fold, capital formation globally, without borders, people trying to wire money from one place to the other, but knowing sort of what the expected outcomes are, would be a really great thing to see come back into the space. And we'd no doubt see a bunch of investment coming into companies building here, and abroad. And I think that is a net positive. It's just a matter of getting the train back on the rails for that one.
Yeah, well, there's so much better understanding now. I mean, there's so many, really, even in Australia, let alone the rest of Asia, so many fund managers now who've come from traditional financial services backgrounds that really understand capital formation. But they also really understand crypto. And they really get it. It was, I guess, in the ICO boom in 2017, you just had the buzzword of crypto, and anyone who could rip off a smart contract just going and starting their own token, Doge or whatever, right?
Yeah, that was it. I remember in 2017, 2018, going to conferences across the United States, and most of the conferences back then were being hosted by law firms. It was the the SaaS that they were sort of pushing at the time, ways that you could do it sort of safely. But 20,000 people filling the Staples Center at the time, and just being blown away by this idea that, wow, all these people are coming here and having this conversation around what the future could look like. And, some of the companies that I met there and were introduced to, in that era, some of them are still going, not many, thankfully, not many. But the ones that have survived that, have really gone on to prosper quite dramatically. And you see sort of the work they're doing globally in advocating for some of these changes, is really going to have a net impact in things like stable coins. The proliferation there and the shift towards payments, whether it's PayPal or Stripe, cash flow is a really big issue for small business owners. That's just an instant out of the gate win if you're able to, move money immediately, give that cash to the small business owner immediately, and not have things like clawbacks and credit card fraud and all the other things that get in there. It's just, how do you obfuscate away the clunkiness of on-chain wallets and all the other things to make that really simple? And I think we're starting to see, even with Visa, pushing in. Now, Visa have been pushing in here since, 2017, but now we're starting to see them make some major moves, at the biggest institutions and onboarding banks. And I think that's, this was always going to happen. It was just a matter of, getting the right sequence of events together, to get there.
These things always take time. It's so many times I come back to this simple point, and people look at crypto where it is now, and they never look to where it's going. In the same way people looked at, if you looked at mobile technology in 1998 versus, and you said, well, where's this going? It's like, don't worry, trust me on this one. It's going to be good. But it takes time to get there.
It does. Yeah. Well, think about, a great example is the company that I work for within, the 9MSN group was a company called Fifth Finger. It was Australia's first ever mobile marketing company. I had done some work with them back at the record label. We'd driven #1 records, using the technology of premium SMS, which was where you could charge your Optus or Vodafone bill for making a purchase, which was pretty crazy. And there were limits on what you could charge, but it sort of enabled this commerce that removed some of the clunkiness that no one was going to go on in that early stage to buy a record online when we had Sanity with 120, record stores around Australia. And it was a common occurrence for Australians to go and pay $30 for a record.
That's right.
That was how you did it. You had CD players in your car. There was no Spotify, no TikTok. There was just no concept. And so this idea that you could access these digital versions or you could buy a physical version digitally was fairly new. But I remember the stories I would tell is in 99 when they were starting these SMS campaigns, they were running it on a mobile phone plan and getting bills that were like stacks of paper this big for all the numbers that were engaging in, voting and competitions and sweepstakes and all these campaigns they were running. Whereas the concept of that is wild now. You just send it, you send messages via, iMessage or
Telegram,
WhatsApp and Telegram and all these things, and that's normal. Whereas before that was a huge gate. You had limits on how many you could send and how much you would charge based on how many characters, and that it just demonstrates that the technology in time, with that underlying technology, the infrastructure that was being built behind internet protocols and shifting, and the carriers sort of letting go a little bit, eventually led to a point where those massive pipes are still as important as they've ever been for connectivity. It just the freedom of access to content proliferation and all the new models we've got.
Absolutely,
it demonstrates that.
I always just find that the evolution of these things so fascinating, and so many times again you just keep coming back to the point. It's like you can never really look at where things are. You've got to take a step back and go, where is this heading to get really excited about this stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
One really weird and bizarre trend was in India. There was a big proliferation of ringback tones. So, you're calling somebody and you just hear a dial tone when you're waiting for them to pick up the call. The ringback tone, the idea was, I as the user bought a ringback tone and it was effectively hosted on my carrier network. You call me and then you get to hear whatever I want you to hear instead of just the normal dial tone. And it was blowing up in India, and at the record labels, we believed that this ringback tone market was going to be huge because people were paying $4 to $5
really
for this sample of music that would be effectively licensed on your specific number, hosted by your carrier, that you would buy, and people, like culture sort of dictates, would update those on a fairly frequent basis. Now,
so I could choose like Silverchair, and like every time I called you, you'd just hear some Silverchair.
That's right, yeah. And you could then do it by individual and set certain ringtones for certain people. It turns out that people really didn't want that, and they didn't want to pay for it, and it was sort of a non-event. Yeah. But there was a moment there where we were believing in Chris Anderson's The Long Tail, being something that was going to sort of bringing all this content online was going to unlock this untold demand of how people were going to interact with it, and we were wrong about that, definitely.
Trolling out, it's always trolling.
But we were right because the infrastructure we built, the labels, and digitizing all that content, and taking physical layers, working with the operations team. We used to own factories and trucks, and we were sort of vertically integrated back in the day. This process of getting these physical analog recordings, digitizing them in the highest spec we could, getting high res images of the covers of those albums, and then all the metadata that went behind them from who was contributing to it, the length of it, the lyrics, all those things that go in. We did all that work, and because we did that work and we sort of took a century-long view on what it could mean, is things like Spotify were able to sort of come into the market with a legitimate way for people to access that. You can do it through premium, or you could do it through ad-supported models, and that was really a competitor to things like Kazaa and LimeWire and all the things where theft was pretty high. And what Spotify ultimately did was bring a form of legitimacy to this open access that the tail could work. Turns out that people still drive the market still, and it's great to see some Aussies out there with billions of streams, like Kid Laroi and others. But it's the idea that I can go back and I can find anything on demand is pretty cool. But again, it's it comes back to that. Why did we do that at the label? Well, back in those early days of internet access, music were the smallest files that could fit down the internet pipes.
Right.
And so file sharing and P2P networks ultimately garnered around music initially because dial-up speeds just didn't allow for sharing of other forms of content. As we got access to broadband, we started to see Hollywood come in, and it was Hollywood that really sort of took an axe to into that world, and and that's how we ended up with things like Stan in Australia. It was certainly a massive innovation for its time. Mike Sneesby was driving that, and then we had Netflix, and I remember living in the US and getting the physical CDs sent and choosing from the online option, and then them saying, or you could actually digitally watch this version. It's like, oh wow, that's kind of cool. Like the idea of Blockbuster and Video Easy
yeah.
not going in there and seeing the new release and being, sold out or fully committed. It's like, wow, what? Whereas now people will scroll Netflix for 45 minutes and end up going to bed because they can't make a decision on which semi-average content to watch.
It's so fascinating that you've got this the digitization of like everything. It's like music's been digitized, and movies are now being digitized, streaming's been digitized, everything's been digitized. Yet, we look at things like, crypto, for example, which is like a digitization of, I guess, monetary networks in a lot of ways. And people go, oh no, well, it's don't know if that's the future, but it's kind of, it's actually treading a well-worn path. It just takes some time.
It does. And I don't think it's asking for permission either. Technology typically doesn't. Software will eat the world, and that's been proven in every industry I've been in, from working in the music industry to media. We were building the programmatic trading platforms for people to be able to transact in media. Media was a very old school way of how you did media buys, and you can go and sort of watch the introduction of television in shows like Mad Men, and that was sort of how people bought media. And even at Nine Entertainment, that was definitely an old school way of how people did it until Microsoft with Drive PM and others started to introduce this idea of bidding and programmatic buying. And then we got into futures markets, which is something that Juice sort of introduced in mobile formats, which was way too early and way too ahead of its time. But now you look at crypto and it's like, well, it's the same thing, really. You can, forward buy gas markets on Ethereum now, for example, to try and avoid, the spikes in gas fees for when there's network congestion. And so we're going to see these applications. Some of them are well trodden in the financial markets as well, and it's an inevitability. And it doesn't really matter whether people like it, disagree with it, don't like it, are mad because they didn't buy Bitcoin early, or they're upset that they got rugged on a meme coin or an ICO back in the day. The fact is, the technology and the cryptography that's been going since Alan Turing was trying to crack the Enigma code has been sort of barreling down this hole to get to a point where we would have a better, more secure internet, and we need it, quite frankly.
Yeah, and there's so many big picture ideas as well. I remember listening to the guys we had Fakar on here. I remember Luke was sort of, I've got to give him credit for it. I didn't come up with his examples, but he was sort of talking about how, eventually we'll be able to have the big concept of Web3 is owning your own information, owning your own data. And every day, you've got Google and Facebook and whoever else that tracks your data, and they sell that and they use that, and it makes them billions. And I often use this example, and I'll say, well, look, your data gets captured by whoever. Like just on the way you drove here today, Google's capturing some information from you, and they've made billions off all that collectively. How much have you made for that? And everyone's like, well, none, as it turns out. But you go, well, hang on, there's a concept called Web3, which is kind of allows you to kind of tokenize that information. So you can still sell it if you want, but it's yours to decide whether you want to sell it for it. Yeah. And it's a huge idea, but it's like something, there's a product that everyone wants. If I'd happily, I don't care if Google knows that I came whichever way to work today, but it'd be nice if I could get a clip for that. Yeah, well, and I think that's right. I think the idea that, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product has definitely been where Web 2 ended up as part of the reason I could no longer, sort of participate in that world was, I mentioned, sort of programmatic buying of media and things of that nature. What was actually driving that, the demand behind that, and this is, tens of billions of dollars, moving around in how people are transacting online to put ads in front of people, was basically driven by data. So no one's buying like an ad unit. They're buying a bunch of targeting data that is delivered through an ad unit. And so you're right, like that information is being sold and transacted, and those companies are making, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars off that. You look at how much, YouTube alone is making. And yes, they're tracking it all, and it's all mapped, and from, they can track people in your household. People are talking about people, Instagram listening to what you're saying, and then you're seeing targeted ads. Yeah, it's crazy. And everyone knows it happens. And they do. Whereas, Web3, the read, write, own, the ownership aspect of it, people talk about that when it comes to things like NFTs and gaming and, identity and things of that nature. And I think that's really important. Where we should expect to see that go, though, is this idea of brokering permission, which is one thing ultimately that crypto and blockchains can enable and empower, is this idea that you can determine
what elements of your identity can be shared across what specific platforms.
Yeah, right.
And you might do that, in an ad-supported way where you get access to certain services. You could be compensated for that. One of the challenges that we had back in the day of like, why did ads proliferate media to the point that they did? It's because simply they couldn't track it. You used to get newspapers delivered to your door and you pay a subscription. That sort of didn't track with generations that moved online, but those online audiences weren't willing to pay to access the content to the same degree that older generations were. And so jamming a bunch of ads and a bunch of targeting data in front of you is how that works. Today, we can literally do that with microtransactions. We haven't gotten there yet, but that's an inevitability. And it was very clear even in the media days, that shift where, you could effectively be reading an article and paying fractions of a cent for that, which is going to yield more than the CPMs that the media companies are earning today, which is, the cost per 1,000 impressions that they have to sell it on, which is a really inefficient model. It comes from, effectively magazines. And that's being applied to digital eyeballs, which doesn't make sense. They can make a lot more money, but the technology that exists for them to do that today is absolutely crypto. And so, it'd be great if the media stop hating on crypto to the extent that they understand that it could actually be what saves them and could be what generates more money, so we can get a bit more integrity in journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so fascinating, right? And so many of us in the industry kind of, I guess we're in a bit of an echo chamber when we talk about this stuff and go, oh, why can't other people see this? But like, I guess for most people, it'll only be when it hits their back pocket or hits them personally that they're kind of going to wake up to the fact. Like using my example of somehow tokenizing your own online data. Let's just say, I know it's not there yet, but let's just say you could just own your own data. I think everyone would be all of a sudden really excited about the potential of crypto. You know what I mean?
And look, and they're like the founder of Juice, with Neil Sweeney in Canada, started a company called Reclaim, as in reclaim your data back. And it's the exact idea. It's the idea of zero-party data or first-party data where I, as the user, go and build my own profile. So people forget, the reason why Facebook and before them MySpace had such a big moat was Facebook was effectively the last network where you went and told it all your favorite movies, who was in your family, where you'd eaten, checked into certain places. You just gave them a bunch of data that they've been able to monetize ever since. And other networks have had to rely on, attention and video to monetize you, like TikTok. But, and that's where we've seen, influencers, driving that market versus data driving those markets is, that's a big shift. But the ideas like Reclaim, and there are others where you can then opt into certain services, and then those media companies could effectively go to those brokers, those data brokers, with permission from the customers and access those and turn them on. And inevitably we'll see sort of blockchains be, the layer that makes that a really seamless way of being able to move value.
Yeah, it's just really fascinating stuff. And I think that was you couching sometimes the terms of how crypto could be done using examples of past technology is a great way to relay kind of where we are in the cycle and get people excited about the big concepts.
Definitely.
So we're like right now, I know it's a tricky question because nobody knows exactly how it's going to come out. And business models are always developing along with the technology. It's kind of, like you said with the example with what do you call it, where you choose what sound comes out the other end.
Oh, the ringback tones.
The ringback tones, right. This iterative process of where you think the market's going is never quite where it goes, but it works its way out. Like, I'm asking you to have perfect 2020 vision before it's happened, but like right now, sort of where are those sort of opportunities, particularly in crypto? Where is the sort of next things that kind of need to happen to really, be the next leap forward? Is it real world tokenization of assets? Is it, just what is it?
Well, I think tokenization of assets is to some degree even boring. Like I don't even think that's up for debate. I think the idea of, physical records and them being stored and then managed sort of, offline, and the inefficiencies that come with that, particularly in a global trade environment that we've got today, that just doesn't hold steady. Now, the other thing that sort of goes behind all of this, like why were we able to build the content or the digitized versions of content to be able to distribute to so many different channels so that people can have music on demand? It was formats and standards. And I think that's what crypto brings. And so the idea that financial institutions can come in and bring these assets on chain and tokenize them and adhere to a global standard is probably an unlock. And so I don't think that that's particularly like a clear insight into like that's something that's going to get people really excited. I think for people who haven't been paying attention and they're just starting to pay attention, tokenization is exciting because they're just starting to wake up to the power of what blockchains can do outside of price of tokens.
Yep.
But I don't think that's probably the thing that will get people excited. I don't think that's going to be what gets consumers or retail excited about how this affects them. I think payments is a pretty easy one to see. I think, just what we're seeing with stable coins, the fact that Visa's taking this platform out to banks and saying, hey, we can help you use, our trusted technology. We've been in this space now they've been in the space for about 7 years, testing and, BlackRock, have been thinking about this for a long time as well.
Yep.
And you're starting to see trusted entities bring access to that technology to other companies. And so payments makes a lot of sense. I think it's got to be invisible. I think the idea of, apps on phones wasn't new. Side-loading apps, the carriers used to preload the apps on phones. That was sort of how it was always done. What the iPhone changed ultimately was it came out of the box. You didn't have an instruction manual. Every other mobile device at the time did. It was a global standard, like one platform. You built on one operating system. You shipped your app and it worked, and you could choose which countries you made that app available to. And you had a billing mechanism through Apple, and they'd take their chunk. That was the distribution method. And for the consumer, they just pulled it out of their phone. They found the app in the app store. They downloaded it. They could use it, and they're off to the races. So you removed the hurdles of carrier billing, working out which one, how to get it on their phone. It just was easy. And that is why we have things like Facebook and TikTok and being as big as they are. So for crypto to ultimately succeed there, it needs to be that level of access, that level of ease, that reduction of UX to the point it's invisible. I think the things that we're seeing today in DeFi and NFTs are really exciting because it's pioneer work, but it's unlikely that's what we see as the final end use case. I think all technologies, when they introduce these new features, it's that frontier work that sort of leads to new discoveries. And totally. I won't pretend to know I know what those new discoveries will look like, but I would say that they probably look a lot different to what we think they're going to look like today, because in any other technology cycle, it's very hard to predict what they are. And whatever new thing gets that traction, hits that mass adoption, crosses the chasm, so to speak, will probably lead to a bunch of new things that we just would not have expected to see. Vitalik said, didn't expect to see NFTs, and there is a functional value to what an NFT could introduce. It's just the speculation around the value of it was probably a bit of a misnomer at the time. It's not to say that some of them don't hold value and won't for a long period of time. They will. It's art. But there is a lot of sort of one of 10,000 collections that were just a joke, and it was early testing in AI, whereas today
experimentation.
Whereas today it's like you can go in there and probably create that with AI yourself through ChatGPT and Midjourney and all these other great tools that weren't available back then. And so we'll see use cases, grow and adopt there, which the consumers will enjoy, and blockchain should just be this invisible layer that just gives them more security, more control, more access.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We raised so many really great points there. I think one sort of simple thing, like just the simple stuff is really important, like the unlocking of a standardization. Like the really simple analogy is before rail gauges were simple, right? In Australia, you drive it. We're a federation, and you'd take your steam train down to the border, and then all of a sudden there'd be a different gauge, and the inefficiencies that come with not being able to drive your train from Sydney to Melbourne, until they standardized it.
Switching the train
and all this kind of stuff. And in the exact same way with crypto and banking, like it's where those misstandards meet that causes the friction. And crypto has a standardization globally, which is actually really important.
Trains are an interesting one because, like you said, you may not have been able to cross the border efficiently without switching trains. Also, when we're, grew up in Newcastle, Gunninan, we made trains there. The funny thing about that is, when we started ordering trains from overseas, we sometimes didn't understand the energy requirements or the electricity requirements of those trains. So sometimes they wouldn't work. So we had to refactor those trains. So the thing with trains is they're not really a global standard. You're sort of building them for, the energy networks, electricity grids, and the rail gauges of a particular country. A better example for global trade is probably shipping containers.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
I think the idea that shipping containers as a global standard just led to this proliferation. Like we have goods and services being transacted and sent all around the world constantly, and that has sort of led to this globalization. I think that sort of is the front runner of like why crypto and where can the digital delivery of that occur and why does it happen? And then you think about how do you police the oceans? Well, most of the regulatory effort or most of the work that goes around sort of identifying what is going in or coming out of those containers is happening at the ports, which is done at a regulatory level, like based on a jurisdiction. And those boats will move sort of around the world in open oceans. And I think that's sort of like crypto, as digital assets are sort of transacting around the globe, and then as they're coming in, that's probably why there is so much emphasis on the exchange being sort of the central on and off ramp for how consumers will access that safely and securely. And I think that's probably a good analogy. Yeah,
we've covered some incredible analogies today, I think. So what's next for Pier Two, Jake? We got you guys have been going well. It's like you said before, just been super busy. But what's kind of the sort of main focus for you for the next sort of into this next bull run?
Yeah, look, the expansion into the APAC region is for sure front of mind for us. How do we do that? Well, we've got to be supporting more proof of stake networks. So that's obviously something that we're very focused on. So we're supporting a number of other networks. So Solana, Near, Polygon, things of that nature, which are proof of stake chains. There's a lot of new chains that are coming out as well that are really exciting. Like Chain's definitely one that we think is going to garner a lot of attention and energy for sure. Making sure that our partners can access those and securely stake is going to be really important there. And then supporting the protocols as well. So that's something that we are always doing in the background. So we're really deep in the Eigenlayer ecosystem for restaking, working with Symbiotic, shortly going to launch, Babylon, which is restaking on Bitcoin, and then more coming into Solana. So making sure that we're out there supporting those protocols. And then, of course, the benefit of sort of restaking is the idea of sort of renting economic security of these, big chains like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana is the proliferation of, AVSs, actively validated services, or networks that will launch off the back of that. And so supporting those as well. So we see this sort of modularization of these apps, borrowing this economic security from these chains and launching and giving consumers more choice and a wider range is going to just see, a really, a major pickup in velocity of new services that consumers will see and be able to interact with. And so I think that's going to be really neat.
Yeah, awesome. And what's the best way people get in touch with you?
Yeah, we're on Pier2.com. So that's PIERTWO.com. We're on X under the Pier2_com. And you can track us down there. And we're if you're investing through funds and exchanges, tell them if you're staking, you want to use Pier Two. Do it securely.
Send it to you. I guess they can also reach out to Jack and Pat. I saw Pat. He was coming hot from a side event in Singapore, and he's way to La Passat for a satay late night.
Yes,
so it was perfect timing because I was hungry as well.
Great food. It's you can't beat the food in Asia. That's I was always a Mexican food man, living in the US for so long, but I think I'm coming around to being more Asian influenced by the food. It's pretty great, and you'll see Pat, Jack, and I on the road and in all these events. And please come up and say hi.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thanks, Jake. Thanks for coming on. That was like I said, we covered some awesome analogies and some really interesting concepts. So thank you very much. We know we're going to see you around. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Done. All right, good.
Independent Reserve, the trusted cryptocurrency exchange.